Morning. So I'm gonna depart from my co-panelists because I haven't actually worked in the podcast space for very long compared to my three very esteemed co-panelists. And truthfully, I've only been writing about podcasts aggressively about the past 2.5 years. But I've been thinking a lot about it, of course, since way back in 2009, which is a little bit after Eric started working on them in NPR. I stumbled onto them as just an accident. I was in college, and I was sort of very much at lost in the world, trying to figure out some stuff that I'm interested in. And it's I think like many people who discovered podcasts around that time, it was sort of like a little sort of mysterious gem that existed on the internet. And a lot of my sort of thinking and hopes around it and analysis of it comes from that feeling of whether there's something of a weird opportunity and a fresh start that's embedded within the story of podcasting, even 10 years on. And I've been sort of very reflective this morning for some reason. A lot's been going on in my life, but we'll just skip that life part and get straight to the meat of this. So I'm going to depart from my co-panelists and take a top-down view, and I'm going to try to provide a taxonomy of news podcasts. I know this is kind of like a tricky enterprise because categorizing things can be overly reductive, and it's somewhat of a political act. And there's always going to be room to debate and quibble about certain phrases or names or nomenclature. But I think a taxonomy is a productive exercise for two reasons. First, the podcast ecosystem is a weird, chaotic, and messy place. As Eric has alluded to, there are millions upon millions of minutes of potential things to listen to right now. And I think it's not unlike the early days of blogging, as Josh actually has written about before in Neiman Lab. And the news podcast genre, as relatively young as it is very much a microcosm of that dynamic. We're seeing a lot of news teams trying out a bunch of different things in different ways to broadly achieve different goals. So a taxonomy, I think, can give us a sort of a baseline system to efficiently think about this expanding universe of news podcasts and news podcast experiments. And secondly, for those of you in the crowd who are thinking about developing projects in this space, I hope that this taxonomy can sort of serve as a menu of options that you can sort of choose from, think about, sort of gel over and all of that. Two quick caveats. First, this taxonomy is distinctly American-centric because very much like media is culturally specific. I think it might be different, or it might work differently in different countries or different languages. It really depends on the specific context you're working from. It's American-centric because I work in this sort of that's my current primary scope, just focusing on American industry as it sort of emerges. And the second caveat is this is very much a work in progress. There's a couple of really neat phrases that Andrea, Lisa, and Eric sort of threw out over their respective presentations. I really love the phrase narrative news. I'm probably going to throw out my number 7 and use yours instead. Fantastic. The first category, the first model is what is called there's this sort of a rough overview of the sort of models that I have in mind. We're starting off with the gabfest model, or the conversational format. This is sort of the prototypical archetype of the podcast medium. It's literally, at its essence, it's a bunch of people around mics, and then you cut it up a bunch of different ways. It's typically designed as a discussion that recaps the news of the week or events of a week, and it generally functions to provide listeners with context and commentary. And hopefully, as a result of those things, it provides them with clarity. But most importantly, it also gives listeners a space to sort of feel out and process the news. And I think that's the most important aspect of conversational podcasts specifically, but podcasts more generally, is that space of feeling and processing. The conversational podcast is deceptively easy to set up, much like many other podcasts, or people who talk about podcasts by saying everybody can start a podcast. It's deceptively easy to set up, but incredibly hard to do well, and it's incredibly hard to scale and in an effective and an effective way that makes sense and revenue, really. Examples in this genre include the Slate Political Gabfest, which I think is sort of the exemplar of this model. Vox.com's The Weeds, Politico's Nerdcast, NPR and Politics. There's a running list over there. Next up, we have the documentary format, and this is sort of really generally the stuff that people talk about when they're talking about podcasts these days. And this is where the medium tends to get most buzz. The documentary podcast is often in-depth, it's deeply reported, it's a highly produced narrative project, and it also happens to be where the form really gets to flex its storytelling muscles. You could roughly sort of say that they perform around the same function, or they sort of exist in a marketplace very similar to the magazine feature. More often than not, they're a deeper, longer story told within a full sense of context. And that's sort of what they set out to do. Examples in this category include the stuff that you probably have heard about, This American Life, In the Dark, Radio Ambulante, 99% Visible. But you can also point to sort of specific collaborations between audio teams and more traditional publishers, like the way This American Life has worked with the New York Times or ProPublica on sort of investigations in the past. That they tend to sort of fall from that model. Moving on, we have the interview podcast, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a pretty straightforward system. It's a podcast that's just an interview. The interview format, of course, is a tool that's commonly used in other formats, like documentaries most especially. But the interview podcast itself is its own creature with its own dynamics, and that shouldn't really ever be forgotten. An interview podcast is also very, very much bursting in potential. It can break news. It can litigate an issue. It can create a biography, as it's often used to do. And it can also be used to explain something. And much like the gabfest model, I think the interview podcast is often perceived to be easy to set up. Again, that's deceptive because it's immensely difficult to make an interview podcast or interviews in general more valuable for a broad audience. Examples include Rico Decode, Terry Gross herself, so on and so forth. Next, we have the news magazine, which is sort of like more of a traditional carryover. It's a multi-segmented variety show that's either built around a specific news topic or theme or around a central reportorial figure. The sort of big example here, of course, is Mike Pesca at The Gist. It's more of a, again, as I mentioned, it's more of a straightforward carryover from traditional radio. It's what we think about when we think about NPR's All Things Considered or Morning Edition, only that it's designed and structured very much as a standalone, on-demand audio experience without the running sort of broadcast clock to define its terms. Examples are on the list over here. I want to also point out that I kind of view Trumpcast and On the Media within this prism. The sort of multi-segment or orientation of the structures is what is the most revealing thing about the news magazine, in my opinion. Then we have the Explainer podcast, and this is the part of the taxonomy where we get a little bit more granular. The Explainer is defined less by its structure and format and more by the specific value it offers listeners, which is to imbue them with the fundamentals of a given topic. These podcasts provide listeners with meaning, context, and history, and at best, it's more evergreen than timely, even though topicality can be a very, very strong hook. The strongest example of this in my mind is New Hampshire Public Radio's Civics 101 that kind of goes through the sort of fundamental institutions of America, with each episode sort of very, very broadly pegged to something that happened in a news cycle within a sort of 1-2 week period. Moving on, we have the local podcast, which is a bit of a loose subgenre, and it's one that's growing to be particularly interesting to me. I'm currently doing some research work with Democracy Fund on that subject, and in the fall I'll be a Neiman visiting fellow doing a bit more digging on this sort of growing subgenre. The local podcast obviously is defined more by a focus on its place and on a specific place and its residents, using them as subject matter and also thinking about them as its constituency and consumer base. The local podcast tends to privilege community interaction, and to a large extent, it's community-driven, and that's really, really important in this formula. And it's also more explicitly a civic building tool. As examples is WBEZ's Curious City, Oregon Public Broadcasting, This Land is Our Land, which followed the Bundy trial, and The Rise of Charm City, which is a very good podcast, in my opinion, about Baltimore. And finally, we have the Daily News / Morning News / Narrative News podcast, which is currently where we're seeing a lot more activity these days, as Lisa's discussion has borne out, and Andrea's as well. It's an emerging, somewhat experimental form, and is best thought of as being defined by its, I like to think about it being defined by its relationship to how it fits a certain use case, or how it fits into an intended consumer's user behavior. It bears some an analog to the morning news hour or the morning newsletter, and I think in this current iterations and the current experiments that we're seeing, it feels like they're the strongest adaptation of the newspaper in the audio format. Examples are, kind of shortly in this point in time. The Daily, obviously, up first, and something called the Outlines World Dispatch, which came out, which was sort of debuted last week. Even though it's sort of more magazine-y and less newsy, there are very strong news elements about that show. So 2 quick closing thoughts before we get to the real meat of this, which is the panel. Firstly, I think it should be noted that news podcasts are aggressively evolving, and they're evolving very, very quickly. As we move forward in time, we're seeing more intentionality in producing higher quality experiments, in producing better show design, and in thinking more aggressively about the user experience and the casual audience. And finally, I think podcasting is just like a weird medium in general. It is to an extent, considerable extent, it's a forgotten child of Apple. It's not a particularly sexy media category. I've been told many times that the podcast medium is unlikely to ever experience a hockey stick growth, which seems to be the kind of conversations that dominate media conversations. And it's still technologically underdeveloped in many ways. But because it's unsexy and it's slowly but steadily growing, and because it's still a place that's allowed for really interesting pieces of journalism and art and culture despite all of its works, I do believe that the podcast medium is something of an opportunity for a fresh start to realizing the original dream of digital publishing, which seems to have been dearly lost over the past 10 years. And I don't think that's a small thing, and I think it's really interesting to be staring at the forefront of this thing that we haven't fucked up yet. And that is a really powerful thing, because we're living in such an imperfect, broken, fractured world. Let's not screw up this piece of land by drilling holes into the ground. Yeah, that's all I got. Let's go straight to the panel, I think.